The morning began like any other October dawn in Maplewood Estates, the kind of suburban morning that promised nothing remarkable, nothing that would alter the trajectory of my remaining years. I was 62 years old, recently retired, and still learning how to fill the hours that used to belong to someone else entirely. I woke at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before my alarm, my body still operating on the internal clock that had governed 3 decades of commuting to the Boeing manufacturing facility in Everett. Even without the alarm, even without the necessity, my physiology refused to acknowledge that I no longer needed to arrive anywhere at any particular time. The muscle memory of productivity ran deeper than I'd anticipated. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar morning song as I shuffled through the kitchen in worn slippers, the ones Sarah had given me 7 years ago, the ones I refused to replace even though the sole on the left one had begun separating from the upper material. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood was still sleeping. Maplewood Estates wasn't the sort of place where people rushed. It was the sort of place where people retired to, where the lawns were maintained by professionals, where the streets were lined with deciduous trees that required no intervention, where the rules existed to maintain a particular vision of stability that everyone had apparently agreed to adopt. The Seattle morning was gray, which meant it wasn't actually raining, which meant it was technically a good weather day by Pacific Northwest standards. I'd been checking the weather with religious consistency ever since I'd decided that my project would be a car restoration. Something about the ritual of checking conditions felt purposeful, in a way that flipping through television channels or reading news articles on the internet no longer did. I was standing at the window, holding my coffee mug, the one with the faded Boeing logo that Sarah used to joke made me look like I never actually left work, when I first saw the flatbed truck pulling onto my street. It was early, too early for delivery vehicles, which meant something special was happening. The truck moved slowly, the driver clearly consulting his GPS repeatedly, trying to locate an address that my neighborhood probably wasn't well known for. The vehicle on the flatbed made me forget about my coffee entirely. It was a 1965 Silver Cloud II, the kind of automobile that existed in my memory only as photographs in magazines, only as nostalgic references in classic car documentaries, only as machines that existed in other people's garages and museum collections. And yet here it was, being delivered to my driveway like an improbable dream that had somehow manifested into physical reality. I set down my coffee and moved outside onto the driveway, still wearing my slippers. The morning air was cool but not cold, that perfect Seattle autumn temperature where the chill carried hints of rain without actually committing to precipitation. The flatbed driver was already positioning the vehicle, carefully rolling it down the metal ramps with the precision of someone who understood that these machines required respect. The car was simultaneously magnificent and broken. The paint, what remained of the original paint, was oxidized to a gray that looked almost intentional, almost artistic in its devastation. The chrome had adopted a dull patina, though underneath that degradation you could still see the underlying shine, still see hints of what the craftsmanship must have been when this vehicle was new, when someone had lovingly assembled its components in London, when it had represented the pinnacle of automotive luxury. The interior was entirely concealed behind the filth of decades. I could make out leather, or what had been leather, now cracked and colonized by the inevitable decomposition that occurs when fine materials are abandoned to the elements and the various creatures that seek shelter in them. "That's going to need some work," the flatbed driver said, and I nearly laughed at the understatement. "Yeah," I agreed, still staring at the machine as it settled onto my driveway with a soft mechanical thud. "Yes, it will." I'd purchased this automobile at an estate liquidation 3 weeks earlier for $8,000. The deceased owner had been a distant neighbor in the previous neighborhood where I'd lived before downsizing to Maplewood Estates. The man's children hadn't known what to do with such a machine. They were professionals who lived in the Bay Area and Seattle, who drove Japanese sedans and electric vehicles, who understood that such antiquated machinery had no place in the modern world. The auction house had suggested that the vehicle was potentially valuable, but that the restoration costs would vastly exceed any realistic sale price. No one in the family particularly cared. I cared. For the first time since Sarah's death 14 months ago, I felt something that resembled purpose. Cancer is a process, not an event. People often speak of it as though it were a sudden catastrophe, as though one day the person is healthy and the next day they're gone. That's not how it actually works. What actually happens is a gradual erosion, a slow dissolution of the things that make someone themselves. Sarah had been diagnosed in February. By March, she was undergoing chemotherapy. By June, she was in hospice. By September, she was gone. 14 months of retirement stretched out before me like an ocean of empty hours. I'd imagined that I would travel, that I would finally have time to pursue hobbies, that I would spend my days in purposeful leisure. Instead, I spent my days trying not to think about the specific quality of silence in a house that used to contain another person. The car changed that calculus. I've always understood machines. My career at Boeing had been spent in precision manufacturing, in the quality control division where tolerances were measured in fractions of millimeters and where the stakes were measured in human lives. If a component failed, if a calculation was even slightly miscalibrated, people could die. This had never been an abstract concept for me. I'd seen the schematics for every part I'd approved for assembly. I'd understood that my work mattered not in some philosophical sense, but in a concrete, quantifiable way. Automobiles were different. They were also systems where tolerances mattered, where precision determined functionality, but the stakes were lower and the possibilities were wider. A restoration project meant understanding every component, every mechanism, every piece of a complex system. It meant taking something that had been abandoned and returning it to its intended state. It meant channeling time and attention into something concrete. I'd been reading about the Silver Cloud 2 for years. In my boredom during retirement's early months, I'd researched various classic automobiles, had fallen in love with different eras of automotive design. The Silver Cloud 2 represented a particular moment in history, the mid-1960s, when luxury automobiles were unapologetically extravagant, when craftsmanship was considered worth the expense, when the very purpose of such a vehicle was to represent something aspirational, something beyond mere transportation. The vehicle on my driveway needed perhaps 18 months of work. The engine was seized. The interior required complete reconstruction. The electrical system was almost certainly non-functional. The hydraulic systems had likely turned into immobile sludge. But beneath all of that, the bones were sound. The frame was solid. The design was elegant. Under all the years of neglect, there was still a car in there, waiting to be restored. I spent that first day simply looking at it. I didn't attempt any work. I didn't even open the hood. I simply walked around it repeatedly, studying the architecture, understanding the challenge, appreciating the magnitude of the project I'd undertaken. The September afternoon turned into September evening. The September evening turned into darkness. The darkness turned into the kind of Seattle night where the city lights blurred against the low-hanging clouds, creating an atmosphere of intimate obscurity. By midnight, I was still looking at the car. I think if I'd known what was coming, if I'd understood that this automobile would become the catalyst for a conspiracy that would threaten my home, and my financial security, and my mental health, and my remaining years, I might have refused the delivery. I might have paid the $8,000 penalty to cancel the transaction and spent my retirement years in the quiet obscurity that I'd imagined for myself. But I didn't know. No one knows when they're being drawn into something larger than themselves. The next morning, I heard heels on my driveway. They were designer heels, the kind of expensive footwear that made a specific sound, a precise clicking that announced professional intentionality. I was in my garage, having spent the night researching engine seizure techniques and deciding on the best approach to disassemble the Silver Cloud's power plant. The sound of the heels made me pause in my research. I emerged from the garage to find a woman studying my car with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. She was probably early 50s, though the quality of her cosmetics and the precision of her fitness regimen made her appear younger. Her hair was blow-dried into the kind of wave that suggested either expensive salon work or considerable personal discipline. Her clothing was what I'd come to understand was business casual. Expensive jeans that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, a cashmere sweater, "Excuse me, are you the new homeowner?" she asked, not bothering to look at me directly. Her attention remained fixed on the car, on my car, as though it represented some sort of problem she was tasked with solving. "Yes," I replied. Marcus Holloway. I just moved here about 2 months ago. She finally turned to acknowledge me, and I saw her eyes perform a rapid assessment, cataloging and categorizing me in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. I was older. I was male. I was dressed in work clothes. Old jeans, a Boeing hoodie, the kind of casual attire that suggested no particular pretension. I was clearly someone worth noting for reasons I didn't yet understand. I'm Patricia Kensington, she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, calibrated to communicate competence without aggression. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association here at Maplewood Estates. I recognized the name. I'd met with the HOA before purchasing my house, had reviewed the covenant documents, had attended a neighborhood gathering, where Patricia had presided over a meeting with the kind of practiced authority that suggested she'd been in positions of organizational leadership her entire adult life. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, accustomed to making decisions that others simply accepted and implemented. Nice to meet you again, I said. I remember you from that neighborhood meeting. This vehicle, Patricia said, now gesturing toward my car with the kind of gesture that suggested disapproval, is in violation of our aesthetic standards. I must have looked confused because she continued, her voice taking on the kind of patient tone that people use when explaining something to someone they perceive as intellectually challenged. Residential properties in Maplewood. Estates are required to maintain vehicles that reflect current standards of aesthetic harmony. Inoperable or deteriorated automobiles cannot be stored in visible areas. We have strict guidelines about what can be displayed on residential properties, and I'm afraid your vehicle does not meet those standards. It's a restoration project, I explained. I'm planning to restore it. That's the entire purpose of purchasing it. Patricia nodded, as though she was hearing exactly what she'd expected to hear from someone who didn't understand the rules. Regardless of the intended use, the vehicle cannot remain in its current state on your property. It's creating what I would characterize as a visual disturbance. It sends a message to potential buyers and to existing residents that our community standards have deteriorated. I'm going to need to issue you a citation, and I'm giving you 72 hours to address the situation. If the citation remains unresolved after that time period, daily fines will begin accumulating. She produced a pre-printed form from her purse, a physical form, as though she carried such documents with her at all times, as though she anticipated needing to cite residents on a regular basis. She filled in the information with a pen she extracted from her blazer pocket. The entire operation performed with an efficiency that suggested considerable practice. The citation read, Inoperable Vehicle Storage in Visible Area. Vehicle Identification, 1965 Silver Cloud 2. Violation Code, Section 4.7.2 of Maplewood Estates Residential Covenant Agreement. Required remediation. Vehicle must be removed from visible areas or restored to operational status within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in daily fines beginning Thursday, October 13, 2022. What kind of daily fines? I asked. $50 per day, Patricia said. The fines are clearly specified in the covenant documentation, which was provided to you at the time of your purchase. She was correct. I had received the documentation. I'd also failed to read it with any particular attention, assuming that it would contain the kind of standard HOA provisions that existed in most suburban communities. Lawn maintenance requirements, prohibitions against exterior modifications, requirements that exterior paint colors be approved, that sort of thing. I hadn't anticipated that the covenant would include specific provisions about the appearance of automobiles. This seems excessive, I said. I own the property. I should be allowed to work on my own vehicle on my own property. Patricia's expression remained patient, professional, unmoved. The covenant exists to protect community standards and property values. We all agreed to these terms when we purchased our properties. I know this can seem frustrating, particularly for new residents, but the rules exist to ensure that Maplewood Estates maintains its character and its value. I'm sure you'll understand once you've been here longer. She handed me the citation, smiled a professional smile that didn't involve any genuine warmth, and began walking back toward the street where her vehicle was parked. I watched her go, still holding the citation, trying to process what had just occurred. What I didn't notice, not at first, was that Patricia had spent her entire interaction with me studying the car. Not disapproving glances, not cursory assessment. Her eyes had been cataloging it, memorizing details, analyzing it with an intensity that suggested something more than simple HOA enforcement. I wouldn't understand the significance of that intensity for several more weeks. Chapter 2. The harassment campaign begins. The next 72 hours were a blur of research and calculation. I contacted several restoration specialists, attempting to understand what could be accomplished in the time frame Patricia had allotted. The consensus was that moving the vehicle indoors would be the fastest solution, but my garage wasn't large enough to accommodate a silver cloud without significant modification. I didn't have the budget for a larger garage. I didn't have the time to construct one. Then I discovered Washington State's hobby vehicle restoration exemption. The statute was buried in the Washington Administrative Code, in Section 360145, and it read, "A property owner may restore a vehicle of historical significance on residential property for a period not to exceed 180 days without municipal permits or homeowners association restrictions, provided that the owner is engaging in hobby restoration and not commercial vehicular repair operations." The exemption existed precisely because the state legislature had recognized that hobby restorers constituted a vital part of historical preservation. The statute was designed to protect the rights of individuals who wanted to restore classic vehicles without facing legal opposition from organizations like Maplewood Estates. I researched the specific definition of hobby vehicle restoration and discovered that it required documentation, proving that the vehicle was being restored for personal use rather than commercial purpose, that no repairs were being conducted for other individuals, and that the work was being performed by the owner or family members rather than professional mechanics. All of these conditions would be easily satisfied by my situation. I prepared a formal response to Patricia's citation, including copies of the relevant statute, documentation that my 1965 Silver Cloud II qualified as a historical vehicle, and a written declaration that I was undertaking the restoration solely as a personal hobby without any commercial purpose. I sent this documentation to Patricia via certified mail, along with a polite but firm letter, explaining that my restoration activities fell under the state exemption and that the citation was therefore unenforceable. Also requested a copy of the original HOA covenant document from 1987, as I'd heard from someone in the neighborhood that many HOA documents contained provisions that were either obsolete or potentially contradicted by subsequent state legislation. Patricia's response arrived 5 days later, in the form of citation number 2, commercial vehicle storage. The citation read, "Unauthorized receipt of external mechanical equipment without prior approval." Citation code, Section 6.2.4 of Maplewood Estates Residential Covenant Agreement. An engine hoist had been delivered to my property that morning. I'd purchased it online because I didn't have access to a proper lift and because proper restoration work required the ability to remove the engine from the vehicle. The hoist was the standard equipment used by automotive enthusiasts everywhere. Patricia had issued me a citation for receiving a delivery. I spent that evening going through the actual covenant documentation that the previous owner of my house had provided at the time of my purchase. The covenant was 73 pages long, written in the dense legalese that characterized most HOA documents. As I read through it, I began to understand the scope of what Patricia considered violations. Section 4.7.2 included a prohibition on vehicles of deteriorated aesthetic quality. Section 6.2.4 included a prohibition on equipment associated with commercial vehicular operations. Section 8.1.1 included a prohibition on activities generating noise exceeding 70 decibels between the hours of 7:01 p.m. and 8:00 a.m. The covenant was exhaustive. It was also, I was discovering, written in such vague language that virtually any activity could be construed as a violation under sufficiently creative interpretation. Citation 3 arrived the following Tuesday. Noise violation. This one read, "Excessive automotive repair activity detected at property during designated quiet hours." Violation code Section 8.1.1. I had not opened my garage that day. I had not operated any equipment. I had been at my property, but I had done nothing to generate She listened politely to my explanation and then said, "Our records indicate that a neighbor reported hearing significant mechanical noise from your property yesterday." "Which neighbor?" I asked. "I'm not able to disclose that information, Mr. Holloway. Neighbor confidentiality is one of the protections we maintain in this community." "But I didn't do any work yesterday," I protested. "You can verify that yourself. Come look at my property. Nothing has been disturbed. Nevertheless, a complaint has been filed and recorded. The citation is now part of your property record. If you believe the citation is in error, you're welcome to appeal it at the next HOA board meeting, which occurs on the third Thursday of each month. The HOA board meeting was 3 weeks away. Citation 4 arrived a few days later. This one cited me for improper waste disposal related to cardboard boxes from my parts deliveries. I'd broken down the boxes and stacked them at the curb for recycling, exactly as the city's waste management guidelines specified. Cardboard materials placed at curbside before 6 a.m. on collection day constitutes improper waste staging, the citation read. Violation Code, Section 9.3.2 of Residential Covenant. By the end of week 2, I'd accumulated 7 citations. The fines totaled $400, and Patricia had indicated that additional citations would continue accumulating at a rate of approximately 1 per day if I did not resolve my violations. The situation had escalated from merely frustrating to actively absurd. I contacted Jim Martinez, the attorney who had handled Sarah's estate. Jim and I had developed a good professional relationship during that process. He'd guided me through the complexities of probate law with a patience that suggested genuine compassion rather than merely professional obligation. "Tell me about these citations," Jim said, and I spent the next 30 minutes detailing the various violations that Patricia had issued. Jim listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "This is textbook harassment, Marcus. At least half of these citations reference regulations that either don't exist or have been superseded by state law. The waste disposal citation is particularly egregious because it contradicts the city's own waste management guidelines. But I have to tell you, the pattern here concerns me more than the individual violations." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that this doesn't look like standard HOA enforcement. This looks like someone building a case file, someone documenting violations, real or imaginary, with the intention of creating a record that can be used for a specific purpose. The question is, what is that purpose?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've tried to be reasonable about this. I explained the restoration exemption. I explained that I'm not violating any state law. She just keeps issuing new violations." "Don't engage with her directly anymore," Jim advised. "Everything in writing. Every interaction needs to be documented. And start keeping your own records. Photographs of your property, timestamps of when you're working on your car, documentation of noise levels if you can manage it. We need to build a defensive file that shows you're complying with legitimate regulations." I followed Jim's advice. I purchased a sound meter and began documenting the noise levels on my property whenever I worked on the car. I took daily photographs of the exterior to establish a timeline of my activities. I kept detailed notes of every interaction with Patricia, every citation, every phone call. I began researching HOA law, attempting to understand my rights and the limits of Patricia's authority. What I discovered was simultaneously reassuring and alarming. Washington. State law provided significant protections to property owners against overzealous HOA enforcement. The state considered HOA covenants to be contracts that were subject to interpretation under standard contract law principles. Ambiguous provisions had to be interpreted in favor of property owners. Regulations that were never actually enforced against other residents could not be selectively enforced against one owner. And most importantly, HOA enforcement had to be proportional and reasonable. Patricia's enforcement campaign failed multiple reasonableness tests. But I also discovered something else. Several public records documenting Patricia's prior litigation history. Patricia had been sued twice in her capacity as HOA president. In both cases, property owners had alleged harassment and discriminatory enforcement. Both cases had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, which meant that the specific details were not available to the public. But the fact of the litigation was documented in court records. Someone had sued Patricia before. This wasn't her first harassment campaign. Chapter 3. The Spiral of Absurdity Week. 3 began with something that might have been almost funny if the situation weren't so aggravating. I received citation number 8, which accused me of improper vehicle orientation. Apparently, I had parked my Silver Cloud nose out in my driveway, exactly the way every other car on the street was parked. According to Patricia's interpretation, all vehicles should be parked at a specific angle that she called aesthetically harmonious, which apparently meant parallel to the garage door rather than perpendicular to it. I called Patricia and asked her to specify which vehicles on the street violated this provision. "I'm not here to enforce universal standards, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice carrying a thin undertone of something that resembled irritation. "I'm here to ensure that properties operate in compliance with the covenant. Your specific property has attracted attention due to the nature of your vehicle and the work being conducted. As a result, certain standards that are applied with flexibility in other situations must be applied with greater precision here." "That's discriminatory enforcement," I said. "That's not discrimination. It's appropriate enforcement based on the specific circumstances of your property." I hung up the phone and made an appointment with Jim to discuss the legal implications of what was occurring. Jim reviewed the citations and his expression became increasingly grave. "This is worse than harassment," he said quietly. "This is coordinated discrimination. She's applying the covenant selectively to you in ways she doesn't apply it to other residents. That violates fair housing principles. The fact that she's essentially admitting that she's applying different standards to your property because of the nature of your vehicle, that's actually evidence of intent. If we ever had to pursue litigation, that recorded conversation could be valuable." "Should I pursue litigation?" I asked. Jim sighed and set down the documents. "I'm going to be honest with you, Marcus. Litigation against an HOA is expensive, time-consuming, and often ultimately unsatisfying even when you win. You'd spend tens of thousands of dollars, spend years dealing with court proceedings, and the outcome would likely be an injunction requiring her to stop the harassment and perhaps financial damages. But you'd still live in a community where she's supposed to be your HOA president. That's a recipe for ongoing conflict. So what are you recommending? First, continue the documentation. Second, I need to do some deeper investigation into Patricia's background and her financial situation. There's usually a reason why someone engages in this kind of behavior. Third, let's prepare a formal objection to the citations to be presented at the next HOA board meeting. We'll ask for a formal hearing on the violations. Make her justify these citations in front of the other board members. Sometimes public scrutiny is enough to make someone reconsider their approach." I nodded, though I was beginning to understand that this situation was unlikely to resolve itself through reasonable dialogue. What I didn't know at that moment was that Patricia wasn't simply harassing me for entertainment or for control. There was a financial dimension to her behavior, a motivation that was grounded in money and professional advancement. There was a reason she'd become interested in my automobile, a reason she was building a case file against me, a reason she'd been willing to abuse her HOA authority to an extent that bordered on criminal. But I wouldn't understand those reasons for several more months. In the meantime, my neighbor Jerry knocked on my door one morning with a confused expression. "Marcus, something weird just happened," he said. "I got a call from your HOA lady asking me about you. Lots of questions about noise coming from your property, commercial activity, that kind of stuff." "What did you tell her?" I asked. Well, the thing is, she already seemed to know the answers. Like, she'd ask me a question, and then before I could answer, she'd clarify what she was looking for. Like she was reading from a script and just asking me to confirm what she already thought was true. This was new. Patricia wasn't just issuing citations. She was conducting interviews, building witness statements, attempting to create a record that could justify her enforcement actions. I documented this interaction with Jerry in detail, including the date and time, a summary of what he'd reported, and his observations about Patricia's scripted questions. Jim's investigation into Patricia's background began revealing interesting details. "She's a licensed real estate agent," Jim reported during one of our phone calls. "Has been for 12 years. She's been HOA president here at Maplewood Estates for 8 years. Her brokerage specializes in what they call luxury estate management, which seems to mean they work with high-end properties and help people navigate. Is that relevant? I asked. Potentially, Jim said. Let me dig deeper. What Jim eventually discovered was the key to understanding Patricia's motivation. Patricia had been sued twice for questionable property acquisition practices. In both cases, the circumstances were similar. Patricia had been the HOA president in communities where she had subsequently helped facilitate the sale of properties at prices that seemed favorable to developers. The lawsuits alleged that Patricia had used her position to make life difficult for property owners who were reluctant to sell, that she'd issued excessive fines and citations as a form of coercion, and that she'd ultimately profited from subsequent sales. Both lawsuits had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, which meant the full details weren't available. But the pattern was clear. Patricia wasn't simply an overzealous HOA president. She was running a scheme, and my property was apparently part of that scheme. Chapter 4. The escalation by week 5. The situation had transformed from merely frustrating to genuinely threatening. I received a phone call from my homeowner's insurance company. The woman on the phone, who identified herself as a coverage analyst, had a carefully neutral tone that suggested she'd been trained to maintain professionalism when discussing sensitive matters. "Mr. Holloway, we've received an anonymous report suggesting that you may be operating an unlicensed automotive repair business from your residential property," she said. "Our policy excludes coverage for commercial activities, so we need to clarify the nature of your activities." "I'm restoring a single vehicle," I explained, "for my personal use. There's no commercial activity. No one is paying me. It's a hobby project, I understand. However, the report mentions that you have professional-grade equipment, that you're conducting extensive mechanical work, and that you've been receiving deliveries of automotive parts. The coverage analyst needs to determine whether this constitutes hobby restoration or professional operation." "It's definitely hobby restoration," I said. "I can provide documentation. I can provide the Washington state statute that covers hobby restoration. This is protected activity. Of course, we'll need to review your documentation. In the meantime, your policy is flagged for review. Once we complete our investigation, we'll notify you of any changes to your coverage or premium." I hung up the phone feeling sick. The insurance question wasn't just harassment. It was a potential threat to my financial security. If my insurance company decided to deny coverage for some reason, if they decided to cancel my policy, that could have serious financial consequences. I provided the insurance company with comprehensive documentation, copies of the Washington state statute, copies of the Silver Cloud's original registration and title, receipts for the work I'd completed, photographs showing that the work was being conducted on a single vehicle, and a written statement explaining that I was undertaking the restoration solely for personal purposes. The insurance company's coverage analyst seemed satisfied with this documentation, and my policy was reinstated. But the anxiety had set in. Someone, I assumed Patricia, had made an anonymous report to my insurance company with the intention of threatening my coverage. The intimidation campaign was escalating. 2 days later, I received visitors wearing the official badges of King County's Adult Protective Services. I was adjusting the carburetor on the Silver Cloud when they appeared at my garage door. 2 women, both in their late 30s, both with the tired expressions of people whose job involved investigating other people's lives without their consent. "Mr. Holloway?" the taller one asked. "I'm Margaret Torres from King County Adult Protective Services. This is my colleague Susan Chen. We're here to follow up on a report expressing concern about your welfare." My heart stopped. "What kind of report?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "An anonymous caller expressed concern that you may be experiencing difficulties following the recent death of your spouse," Susan said, consulting a notebook. "The caller suggested that you might be engaging in behaviors that could indicate depression or obsessive thinking patterns. We're required to follow up on all reports, even though in many cases they result in nothing more than a brief conversation to determine that everything is fine." "Is everything fine?" Margaret asked. I stared at them, trying to process what was happening. "Yes," I said finally. "Everything is fine. My wife died 14 months ago. I'm in grief, but I'm functioning. I have a hobby project. I'm restoring a vintage automobile. That's not obsessive thinking. That's a normal hobby." "Can you walk us through your routine?" Susan asked, so I did. I showed them my house, which was clean and well-maintained. I showed them my financial records to demonstrate that I was financially stable. I showed them my restoration documentation to explain that I was working methodically and rationally. I explained that my previous career had required precision and attention to detail, and that I was applying the same analytical approach to my restoration project. By the end of the conversation, both Margaret and Susan were visibly embarrassed. "Mr. Holloway, it's obvious that you're doing fine," Margaret said. "Your property is well maintained. You're engaged in a legitimate hobby and you seem completely rational to us." Whoever called this in either misunderstood the situation or was deliberately attempting to trigger an investigation. After they left, I stood in my driveway staring at the silver cloud, trying to process the implications of what had just occurred. Patricia wasn't just trying to force me into selling my property through harassment citations. She was attempting to question my mental competency. In Washington state, HOAs had certain powers to force property sales under specific circumstances, including situations where owners were deemed to be creating ongoing disturbances due to mental incapacity. Patricia was building a psychological profile, creating a record of erratic behavior, attempting to establish that I was mentally unfit. She was trying to have me declared incompetent so that my property could be seized and sold. I called Jim immediately and briefed him on the Adult Protective Services visit. "This is escalating into criminal territory," Jim said quietly. "Filing false reports with government agencies, that's not just harassment anymore. That's criminal fraud. What should I do?" I asked. "Document everything. Every single interaction with Patricia. Every citation, every report. We're going to need a comprehensive file if this continues." Over the next week, I attempted to trace the source of the reports. I contacted the code enforcement officer who'd visited my property earlier. He confirmed that he'd received a call from a woman identifying herself as a concerned neighbor, calling herself Brenda, not Patricia, which was interesting, reporting that I was operating an unlicensed auto repair shop. Whoever called clearly didn't understand what they were looking at, the officer had said at the time. "Your setup is cleaner than most professional shops. You've got proper oil disposal, organized parts storage, and you're working on a single vehicle. If you were running an actual business, you'd need commercial zoning and licensing. But this is obviously hobby work." I documented this conversation in detail. Chapter 5. The first real victory. The HOA board meeting fell on the third Thursday of October, 3 weeks after Patricia had first issued the citation on my vehicle. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Maplewood Community Center, a small building adjacent to the main pool facility. I prepared for this meeting with the kind of focus that I'd once devoted to aerospace quality control. I organized my documentation chronologically. I created a timeline of every citation, every report, every interaction with Patricia. I prepared copies of the relevant Washington state statutes. I brought photographs documenting my property and my work. I gathered witness statements from my neighbors who could confirm that I was not conducting commercial operations and that the noise levels were reasonable. I was going to make a formal case to the HOA board. When I arrived at the meeting, I was surprised to see that 30 or 40 residents had also attended. The room was set up with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table where 4 board members were seated, including Patricia. I recognized one of the other board members, a woman named Diane who lived 3 streets over and who I'd occasionally waved to during my morning walks. The other 2 were men I didn't recognize. Patricia called the meeting to order and began with a series of routine business items: approval of minutes, approval of the budget, discussion of a proposed upgrade to the community pool. It took 45 minutes before she addressed my situation. "We also need to discuss ongoing compliance issues in the community," Patricia said, her voice taking on that practiced professional tone that suggested she'd been looking forward to this moment. "Specifically, we have concerns about ongoing violations occurring at one of our properties." She clicked to the first slide on the projector, a photograph of my Silver Cloud 2, taken from her security video footage or one of her numerous drive-by documentation sessions. The image showed the car in all its pre-restoration deterioration, the paint oxidized. "This vehicle has been stored on visible property in direct violation of Section 4.7.2 of our covenant," Patricia continued. "Additionally, the owner has been conducting extensive mechanical work without proper approval, has been receiving commercial equipment deliveries, and has been generating excessive noise during restricted hours. I have documented 17 separate violations over the past 6 weeks. She displayed a spreadsheet showing each citation, each fine, the accumulating total. By her accounting, I now owed $850 in fines. The property owner has attempted to claim that the work falls under some sort of state exemption, Patricia continued. But I believe that exemption is being misinterpreted. The work being conducted on this property appears to constitute commercial operation, and therefore is not subject to any exemption. I'm recommending that we move forward with filing a formal lien against the property to ensure compliance. I stood up. May I respond? I asked. Patricia looked somewhat surprised. Perhaps she hadn't expected me to actually attend the meeting, or perhaps she'd expected me to be intimidated into silence. Of course, she said, with that professional smile that I was beginning to recognize as her tell. Please come to the front. I walked to the front of the meeting room carrying my documentation folder. I'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I decided to approach this more directly, more personally. I'm Marcus Holloway, I began, the property owner in question. I'd like to address some of Patricia's claims, because they're either factually incorrect or they misrepresent what I'm actually doing. I pulled out documentation of the Washington State statute. First, Washington State explicitly protects hobby vehicle restoration for vehicles over 25 years old. The 1965 Silver Cloud II qualifies. The statute provides 180 days of restoration protection without permits or HOA restrictions. My restoration falls directly under this protection. Patricia's citations for automotive work are unenforceable under state law. I could see one of the board members, the woman, Diane, leaning forward with interest. Second, regarding the noise violations, I have sound meter documentation showing that my work has never exceeded 70 decibels, which is the threshold specified in the covenant. Patricia cited me for noise on a day when I didn't even open my garage. When I challenged her on this, she admitted that she was basing the citation on an anonymous complaint, not on actual measurement. That's hearsay. That's not evidence. I displayed my sound meter readings on the projector. Third, regarding the commercial equipment, I received delivery of an engine hoist, the same kind of equipment that hundreds of DIY mechanics use across the state. That's not commercial equipment. That's hobby restoration equipment. I could see some of the residents in the audience nodding. And fourth, I want to address the pattern of violations, I continued. Patricia has issued me 17 citations in 6 weeks. In that same time period, I've observed other residents with inoperative vehicles, other residents conducting work on their properties, other residents receiving deliveries. Patricia has not issued citations to those residents. Why? Because she's selectively enforcing the covenant against me. I turned to face Patricia directly. You've admitted in a recorded conversation that you apply different enforcement standards to my property because of the nature of my vehicle. That's discriminatory enforcement. That's a violation of fair housing principles. And frankly, it violates the basic principle that an HOA president should enforce the rules equally against all residents. The room was completely silent. Patricia's face had gone pale. I have here formal appeals of each citation, I said, pulling out copies of the documentation. I'm submitting these tonight, and I'm requesting a formal hearing where you can present evidence of violations, and where I can present evidence that my activities fall under state protection and that the enforcement has been discriminatory. Diane raised her hand. I'd like to see that state statute, she said. I handed it to her, and I watched as she read through it, her expression becoming increasingly concerned. Patricia, she said slowly, Mr. Holloway is correct. The statute explicitly protects this kind of activity. How did you miss this when you issued these citations? I believe the statute is being misinterpreted, Patricia said, but her confidence had evaporated. She sounded defensive now, uncertain. It seems pretty clear to me, another board member said, one of the men. The statute says hobby restoration of vehicles over 25 years old is protected. This is a 1965 car. That's pretty straightforward. Furthermore, I continued, pulling out additional documentation, I want to address some other concerns. Patricia, you've issued citations for waste disposal that directly contradict the city's own waste management guidelines. You've issued citations for vehicle orientation that don't actually exist in the covenant. And you've been conducting investigations into my mental health with neighbors and my healthcare providers, which is completely outside the scope of HOA authority. I could see the expression on Patricia's face shifting. She was beginning to realize that this was not going according to her plan. I'm formally requesting that all citations be rescinded, that all fines be returned, and that we establish a formal process for resolving disputes that doesn't involve selective harassment. The meeting descended into chaos after that. Other residents began standing up with their own stories. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down, mentioned that she'd received aggressive citations for Christmas decorations that had been up for 2 weeks in December, which violated seasonal standards. The Hendersons mentioned being cited for painting their mailbox a slightly different shade of beige. Each story reinforced the pattern. Patricia was not enforcing the covenant objectively. She was using it selectively as a tool of control. By the time the meeting concluded, the board had voted to table further action pending a formal review of the citations. Diane volunteered to conduct that review. Patricia sat at the head table, looking as though she'd aged 10 years in the space of an hour. I felt something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of genuine victory. As residents filed out of the meeting, people approached me with encouragement. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand. Jerry gave me a thumbs up. Tom, who lived across the street, shook my hand and thanked me for finally standing up to Patricia. "We've all been dealing with her overreach for years," Tom said, "but nobody wanted to be the first person to challenge her directly. Good on you for doing it." Walking back to my car, I felt something that resembled peace for the first time since Patricia had appeared in my driveway with her pre-printed citation form, but I didn't yet understand that this victory at the HOA meeting was going to have consequences. Patricia was going to realize that her normal harassment tactics weren't working on me, and she was going to escalate. Chapter 6. When Desperation Becomes Crime. The night after the HOA meeting, I received an unexpected phone call. It was my healthcare provider's office, specifically the oncology department where Sarah had received her cancer treatments. The doctor's name was Sarah Martinez, the same first name as my wife, which made the call feel oddly poignant. "Mr. Holloway," Dr. Martinez said, "I received a rather unusual phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be from your homeowners association. They were asking questions about your mental health, specifically about whether you were receiving adequate grief counseling following your wife's death." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them that I couldn't discuss any patient information due to confidentiality regulations. But I have to tell you, this felt inappropriate to me. The caller seemed to be building a case against you, asking whether you seemed mentally stable, whether I thought your current project was a healthy grief response or a concerning obsession. That's way outside the scope of anything an HOA would legitimately need to know." "Did they give you a name?" I asked. She identified herself as Patricia Kensington, HOA president. "But Marcus, I wanted to let you know that this kind of thing is not normal. If someone is attempting to question your competency with your healthcare providers, that's worth taking seriously." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen staring at nothing. Patricia was escalating from harassment into territory that was bordering on criminal. She'd made false reports to code enforcement, false reports to my insurance company, false reports to Adult Protective Services. Now she was contacting my healthcare providers, attempting to build a psychological profile that would support her narrative that I was mentally unstable. In Washington state, HOAs had limited authority to force property sales. One circumstance where they theoretically could proceed with forced sales was if they could demonstrate that an owner was creating ongoing disturbances due to mental incapacity. Patricia was gathering ammunition for exactly that kind of claim. She was attempting to have me declared incompetent so that she could somehow force the sale of my property. I called Jim immediately. "We need to talk about taking legal action," I said. "This has gone beyond harassment." "I agree," Jim said. "In fact, I've been doing some additional research into Patricia's." The next morning, Jim arrived at my house carrying a folder thick with documents. He settled into my kitchen with a cup of coffee and began spreading papers across the table. "Patricia has mortgaged 3 investment properties," Jim explained, pulling out county records. "All 3 mortgages are backed by anticipated property value appreciation in your specific neighborhood. She's betting that Maplewood Estates will increase in value because she's planning to flip properties to developers for significant profit." "What does that have to do with me?" I asked, though I was beginning to piece it together. Your property is potentially the most valuable lot in the neighborhood, Jim said. Look at this. He showed me a county zoning map. Most of the properties in Maplewood Estates were zoned exclusively residential. But my property, according to recent zoning changes, had been quietly reclassified as mixed-use development potential. When did that happen? I asked. 2 months ago. Just before the housing market started seeing some significant softness. Your lot being zoned for mixed-use development is worth 3 to 4 times what your house cost. Developers would be very interested in acquiring this property. Patricia, if she can make you sell, either through harassment or through some legal mechanism, could then market this lot as prime development real estate. I felt the world tilting slightly. She's trying to steal my property, I said quietly. She's trying to force you into a situation where you'll consider selling, Jim corrected. Whether that's through harassment, through manufactured legal claims of mental incompetence, or through financial pressure, the goal is the same. Get you to agree to sell at a price significantly below market value for a commercial lot, then flip it for profit. How is that legal? I asked. It's not, Jim said, but it relies on the property owner being too exhausted or intimidated to fight back. Most people, when faced with this level of harassment and legal threat, give up and accept an offer to sell. It's a sophisticated scheme, and the fact that Patricia has done it at least twice before suggests she's had success with it. I spent the next week documenting everything I could find about Patricia's financial situation. Jim was assisting with the legal research, but increasingly I was becoming the investigator, trying to understand the full scope of what Patricia had been attempting. What I discovered was a pattern of behavior that went back at least 7 years. At her first community, Riverside Commons, about 30 miles south of Seattle, Patricia had been HOA president for 5 years. During her tenure, she'd issued citations at a rate significantly higher than the previous HOA president, but the citations had been concentrated against a small number of properties. Within 3 years, those properties had been sold, and Patricia had facilitated the subsequent sales to a developer who built a small shopping center. Patricia's brokerage had received the commission on the sales. At her second community, Cascade Views, which was closer to the Seattle area, a similar pattern had occurred. Patricia had been HOA president for 3 years. Citations had increased